So in this presentation, we want to talk about some of the events that are associated with the walking cycle and how we might break down the walking cycle into phases. And so first we want to define a walking cycle, and we can see that represented here. And we can see basically it's when we go from one heel strike on one side, and this is the right side, all the events that occur until the subsequent heel strike on the same side. That's one cycle of walking. So given that definition, the first thing we can do is break it into two big phases. The one phase is the stance phase. So if we land on that right limb, we basically take weight on that limb until 60% of the cycle here when we are now weight bearing on our opposite side, and then we swing through, which is then why it's called swing phase, to land again for the next cycle. All right, and so basically there's a stance phase, which goes from 0 to 60%, okay, and then there's a swing phase for that same side, okay, and that goes from 60 to 100%, and that makes one stance phase, and a swing phase is one cycle on the right side. That's for one side of the walking of your body. Okay. Then during each one of those phases, we have different tasks that the body's accomplishing. So from 0 to 10% of the walking cycle, you have weight acceptance. So essentially, as the leg comes to land, it has to position itself so it can support the body. So essentially, that's called weight acceptance, and that's from 0 to 10% of stance. And then from 10 to 50% of stance, that's when you're really in single limb support. So that means that the other foot is in swing phase, okay, and your only support is that one limb, right? And then we have from 50% to 100% is called limb advancement. So notice that limb advancement is mostly occurs in the swing phase, but the last 10% of the stance phase is also part of limb advancement. And then we have something called periods, which now we start to break it down into smaller phases. And the periods, for biomechanical reasons, is really we're really interested in, because the periods have different motor control events and biomechanics that are happening to accomplish things in each one of these periods. So let's go through those for a minute. So the first period we're interested in is the loading response. And the loading response really is the same as weight acceptance. They're synonymous because the phasing is the same. So it's basically 0 to 10% of the walking cycle. And essentially the loading response, what's happening is it's really related to the way the foot is positioned. And so the foot here is some aspect of the posterior foot's on the ground, but the whole foot's not on the ground. So you're going from, part of the foot being on the ground to foot flat, and foot flat occurs around 10% of the cycle. And then with the foot's flat on the ground, that's about 10% to 30%. That's the mid stance. And then when the heel starts to come off the ground at around 30%, that's the beginning of terminal stance. And then terminal stance occurs between 30% and 50% of the walking cycle. And the 50% is marked by when the opposite heel strike occurs on the opposite limb. And that last 10% of stance from when the opposite side hits the ground to when the toe comes off, from 50 to 10%, that period's called pre-swing. And you could also relabel this, because we'll talk a little bit about the naming later and what it means in terms of mechanics, but you could also put / push-off, and that would be appropriate. So, but traditionally it's called pre-swing. And then we enter the swing phase, and the swing phase is divided into 3 elements, and that's initial swing, which occurs from 60 to 73%, and 73% is when the ankle is adjacent to the opposite limb. And then finally we go from the end of initial swing to mid swing, and mid swing is when the tibia is vertical with like the global axis or the Earth system. So it's like your hip is flexed, but your knee is not extended yet, basically. And so that's the tibia is vertical. That's around 87% of stance, and that's the end of mid swing. And then terminal swing is the leg fully extended, just as its initial contacts occurring on that right side. Okay, and so basically this graphic is important for you to memorize for this class.